getting interesting and relevant. All right. So yes, we were discussing how at least my temptation, which is probably a common human failing, is to just try to solve the problem as I superficially understand it, rather than going through all the effort of defining the problem precisely before solving it. And in fact, that's kind of what we're trying to do today, is go through a formal definition of the problem that I intend to solve, and then see if this actual formal definition addresses any of your concerns with my informal definitions.
Oh, you make it sound so bad.
All right, so you are live on camera. We have a beautiful document here. Shall we go into it? Did you have a chance to look at this document?
I did, in fact.
Did it make any sense to you?
It did. I liked it.
Excellent. Was it just the Tolkien reference that suckered you in?
Well,
everything you were fine with?
Yeah.
It was fine, but your audio was cutting out. Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3.
These headphones, they just randomly mute for no good reason.
My AirPods have started doing that occasionally, or disconnecting or garbling, whatever.
Yeah, it's good fun. Yes.
All right, so now I can hear you. So let me just walk through the model for our listeners. So I was thinking about, okay, what do I don't want to, I'm trying to define something that generally applies to things. I didn't want to use the term actors, which is sometimes used because that's sort of implies a formal sense of agency. And so I'm going with a more passive entity. And, you know, I didn't want to keep saying entity over and over again, so I was just going to call it ent. I go, oh, wow, that's really cool, because ents are the tree shepherds from Tolkien, and they have two properties that are really useful for this analysis that I only realized after I started writing it down. One, they are known to be wise. Two, they're slow. Like, they take a long time to do anything. It's like, okay, this is perfect. They are, you know, so they work really well. And also my this longest running group was something I called the Entrepreneurs Club that I started before I left Apple. And I actually left it earlier this year to focus in on DBJ. So I have not been meeting with our Entrepreneurs Club. And so the idea of an Ent club resonated strongly with my mind. And then the other thing is that people in this space often talk about game theory and people making rational choices based on games. And so I said, oh, I will play with that literally on several levels of these people are getting together and have a club where they come to play a game, they have to choose a game. And this, by the way, is actually kind of what happens with our family on family game night, in that there's an activation energy to get everyone there. And there's always the danger that people will just say, I'm, you know, refusing to play with you, I'm going to run away. And so trying to juggle that as a practical problem, which I had fun trying to come up with a formal system for resolving it in a very limited case. And so, yeah, so I picked 4 fruits for 4 games and defined this list. But I have to ask, so this is actually a real language, but not a fully functional one. Were you able to, and you've never actually done programming, I don't believe. Very few doctors have.
Not formally.
Okay, but you played around with programming languages on occasion?
Yeah.
Okay, you are quite the polymath. Or dilettante, whichever you prefer.
No,
okay,
I played around.
So you're able to kind of follow the idea of types and lists and things like that.
Yeah.
Great. And so the most interesting thing that came out of this process is I had to come up with a name for the thing that combines individuating and connecting. And I ended up with generativity, which I've been having a lot of fun with the last couple of weeks as I've been putting this together. And even to the point now where I'm starting to think that the most interesting metric for any moral decision is actually the generativity. as opposed to, say, flourishing or entelechia or happiness or utility. Again, that's right now, it's just a random label I've stuck on a pair of numbers, so I don't know if I can make that rigorously true, but it's fun to think about. And so we have this idea of a deadlock. And so this is, sorry.
No, quite. Stupid thing. I will let you.
I give up. I'll through it and then I will argue with you. This is a good way to keep me quiet, is to have headphones that don't work. So please keep going. Generativity.
No,
and
but,
then
okay. Yeah, and then I was talking about deadlock. And so the basic idea is, so in an ideal world, we can assume that people just say what they want, and there's an efficient, readily agreed upon mechanism for arbitrating between them, and then we can all make decisions and move forward. But the reason why I think the boss role is interesting is that that is not always feasible. And so I bring in this formal concept of preference cycles and Irresponsibility Theorem that says, if you've got, people who are honestly stating their preferences, sometimes you will get this weird cycle where at every level, A prefers, ent 1 prefers A to B, ent B prefers B to C, ent 3 prefers C to D, and ent 4 prefers D to A. And that is individually rational, but sort of collectively problematic. And this is somewhat artificial, but it is a real thing that can happen. And it illustrates how just trying to ask everyone to be reasonable and comparing preferences doesn't always lead to a well-defined answer. And so I defined the boss role as precisely the overriding, technically overriding individual preferences in order to reach a quick resolution. And I'm using that as my initial definition of de-individuating. And that was where you were saying, there's something that troubles you about the boss role and de-individuating. And okay, let's see if this formal statement still troubles you the same way or in a different way.
Yeah.
The other point to make before we move on is that I explicitly included energy and implicitly included time in this analysis, because certainly given enough time and energy, you could argue that we will all find a mutually acceptable solution, but you never have infinite time and energy. And therefore, what do you do within those bounded contexts? And trying to make the trade-offs explicit. Okay, that's the overview. Your reaction.
So other than to deliberately create a deadlock, why did you choose 4 games that they could play?
Probably because it's more interesting. I guess you could probably do the same thing with 2, but when it's not as interesting if you have 2 players. So it was fun to have 4 players and 4 games as a nice symmetric way of looking at the problem.
Yeah, it just seems like everything would be solved if you just added another game.
That's true. So would it could, unless of course they all ranked game the fifth. If they all ranked the 5th game at the same level, it wouldn't help. Oh no, if they all ranked it like they all ranked it last, it wouldn't help.
That's true. Yes.
And if there are 3 people with 3 games, right? So yes, so
or
right. Okay.
If you give but okay, so if you then had No, it still wouldn't help. I'm gonna find a way to do this.
There's a
Or
mathematical
if you
theorem
had,
around this, which you can read up on if you want to try and crack it. But
or
the
you
point
could
of
do 3
irresponsibility
games.
theorem is if you have, fixed
My
set of
point is-
preferences
Yeah,
and no preference. There are 3 conditions. We can go into it actually if you want to, because it is an interesting exercise. The 3 conditions are, if there's no dictator, and we have to have this thing called the contorsive criteria, is that the contorsive paradox is if you add another option, that can change everything. So that was your trick. It's like, oh yeah, let's add another preference. But like, if you have a voting system which is resistant to that, and then you define preference like this, then you end up with that impossibility theorem.
yeah. So then the other thing that I was about to say is you change the voting system.
Sure, to what?
Well, she just had in the post, a cardinal voting system fixes it.
Right, so at the price of causing other problems. So there is another voting system called quadratic voting, which fixes some of the problems with cardinal voting. Like the problem with if you add points, like you distribute like 10 points among the 4 games, you're collecting more information, which requires more energy to do so. And then you have the risk of strategic voting. Like I no longer, the nice thing about this system like this is that it is always in your interest to specify your true preferences. In cardinal voting systems.
So the other thing you can do is you could say that whichever game you played last time, you don't play this time. So then you're removing an option out of the 4, and then you're only voting on 3, which by definition can't have a deadlock.
Right. And sure, unless of course you had 5 games. In that case, you have the problem.
Well, no, so you have 4 games going with your original thing.
Right,
and you say
in this scenario, if you can add rules about the last game. So, and that can create another way. So, right, you can add additional algorithms and constraints to do that, which it means though that like if everyone really likes game A, you can't play it again. Right?
This month. Yeah.
This month, right? Yeah. So like there's you can create additional constraints on behavior or more complex systems that allow you to avoid it. And it's true, right? Like the issue is that, and the thing.
So then the system takes on the role of the boss, not an individual.
And this is the interesting thing, right? Is that I've been playing with, actually just today I was thinking about this fact, because I think this is actually really useful, which is that I've been talking about individuating and connecting, and I don't yet have the third thing here, which I've been kind of wrestling with the name of. I was playing with like transcending and resolving or whatever. I ended up using Christ-ening as a placeholder because it's like, it feels like that's the right thing. But I was thinking about where we've been able to resolve these problems in the past. And I realized what often happens is we'll argue about something and say, oh, let's just call it this. Oh yeah, now we're good. And I realized I could use the word christening as the third level, right? Because that conveys, the sense of Christ-ening, like being Christ in a situation, but also like, oh, I found a word for it, or oh, I anoint this system as our system of record, and by christening it, I transfer the anxiety onto that system. And as long as the system can handle the anxiety, we're good. But then because in this case, I already done that with the voting system, which solved the earlier problem. But then, and there's another wonderful result. I love impossibility theorems, which is Godel's impossibility theorem, which is related to the idea, or actually it's an incompleteness theorem, which is related to Turing completeness. which is to say any computable system that's sufficiently complicated will eventually fail to produce, will have an input which will keep it from producing a result, right? So that's the problem. Like if you have a sufficiently complicated system to cover all possible cases, then sometimes it will just take forever.
Yeah.
And so that's the interesting thing, is that there's a trade-off of not just the time and energy it takes it, but also the completeness. Interestingly, this is where I'm ending up at work, where like the systems we have built are so complex that anything I do to try to fix it will actually make the system worse. And so, you know, I'm currently in this project, incidentally, has been forcing me to build out this new system we've been talking about for a long time that is radically simpler. And that's the interesting thing, is that any given technique, you know, leads to a certain level of complexity, but sometimes you can change the technique and end up with a radically simpler solution. Like, for example, in my lifetime, we came up with an algorithm for solving the pie problem. So if you have two kids and they both want, you slice the pie, well, he got the bigger piece, he got the big piece. What you can do, at least when they're old enough, is one of you cuts and the other one chooses. And that way it's like, okay, if you're okay with both, then, and like, so that was like a technical solution to something that was a social problem. And I think that's actually not a bad process. But if you can digitize the problem, then you can get by with an algorithmic solution. But that in itself just sort of, the one thing that I've been talking about with Robbie is that digitization is really a form of violence. Reducing things to a number, like telling someone you have to force rank these priorities, is a coercive thing. And it's like, it's just these four options and you have to do it before we can play. And, you know, if the resulting benefit is better than the energy cost of doing all of that, and like I'm just assuming a system. I'm not really saying, you know, what is the energy cost of the voting system? You know, does it kill a small mammal every time it calculates it? You know, just ignoring all these things. But there's always a cost, and it's like, and there's always a trade-off, and every system ultimately has a failure mode, right? And that's the interesting thing, is that if, and this gets back to our earlier discussion about peacetime versus wartime bosses. The idea is if we've christened a system that basically works and everyone agrees with, then the boss doesn't have to put a lot of energy into it and may not even need to do anything. You may not even need a boss if everyone understands it, has internalized it. But there's a sort of a continuum in my mind between sort of the peer-based, fully adaptive system for the current context, all the way to the jungle guide in the movie, who, you know, smacks, you know, punches somebody in the face to keep them from stepping in quicksand.
Before you go any further, I'm going to forget this if I don't say it, because it's just popped into my head, which therefore makes it tenuous. But another word you could use instead of christening is scapegoating, because it has a negative kind of connotation. But the idea is that if you have an internal tension that you cannot resolve, you have to put that anxiety and tension onto something else. So it's often thought of in terms of sin. And if you think of sin as being the deliberate attempt to resist connection, either with God or with other people, just as a definition, for example, and you no longer can cope with that tension, and so you do things to break the connection, you then can't cope with the consequence of it and still maintain connection. So it then has to be scapegoated and placed onto something or someone else. And that's what the ram was in the Old Testament, where they all put the sin on the ram and then sent it out into the desert, and got rid of the whole nation's sin all in one go. And then obviously on Jesus. but we do this psychologically as well. If there's a tension that's great enough in a society, we'll find something that we can scapegoat, usually a people group that we can scapegoat and say, oh, it's all their fault. If only they weren't here, we would get on fine.
Right.
And so in effect, what you have just done is scapegoated the algorithm and said, oh, it's the algorithm's fault.
Well, yeah, or you know, the right, and well, actually, and this is why I think it's actually like the problem I have with scapegoating is not the negativity, because to me, you know, we've discussed Girard before, haven't we? Renee Girard.
We haven't, but we should have.
Yeah. Okay. So, but the basic idea is that he argues that this is how all societies function, and that Christ was the ultimate scapegoat. So, scapegoating and Christing are similar.
That's what made me think of it. Yeah.
But what made me, the objection I have to scapegoating is it explicitly is the move of pushing the anxiety away from you. Whereas there's the alternate move, which is that where you sort of self-scapegoat, which is, you can say it, but it's sort of a bit oxymoronic, is to say, hey, I will choose to stand up and be responsible for all the anxiety in this situation, make me the scapegoat, which is
that's what Christ did.
He did. That's right. But
that's self-scapegoating.
Right, but I mean, that's true. So self-scapegoating is a interesting term, but to me, it sort of defeats the emotional weight of the idea of scapegoat. In terms of in terms of system design, what I'm saying is that the impulse to scapegoat is precisely to push the anxiety out. And you know, maybe those are the two extremes are sort of in terms of like the connotations of the word scapegoating and Christing, right? Christing is like fully a very, you know, noble internalized kind of a thing, and scapegoating is very much a cowardly, or it's craven is maybe the right word, a craven externalizing thing is the sense that goes with that word. You may have a more technical definition of scapegoating than I'm used to using that word, or how I felt how I feel about it.
Well, I can certainly understand where you're coming from. I guess the reverse of that is usually whatever you're scapegoating doesn't have a choice.
Yes.
And so you are pushing out, but if someone were to stand there and say, scapegoat me, like not obviously because you wouldn't do it if it was that obvious, but put themselves in a position to accept it and be like a lightning rod for the scapegoating, then yes, that is absolutely the polar opposite, but surely that is the center of your 3x3 square, where you take in all of that tension and anxiety from everyone else and you disperse it literally like a lightning rod on a building.
Certainly that is a function that happens, right? It's just that the thing that's interesting to me, right? Like, so my mother is notorious for being a organizer. And so periodically we'll be like, or this happened to me when I was growing up, and now it happens to them when I'm not there, is they'll say, yeah, we went to a wedding. I said, oh, did you have were you standing up? Were you part of it? No, but we got to the reception and the bride and groom were late and everyone was milling around doing nothing. So we organized a game, right? And so there was a very mild sort of boredom going on because there wasn't much going on. And my parents sort of took it upon themselves to be the party planner and organize people into doing something. And, you know, if my brother had been there, he might have had his anxiety increased by his mom, because, you know, and maybe other people did too. But, you know, so, you know, you could call that scapegoating, but I find it not emotionally evocative. That's why I like the term christening more. It's like I am sort of, or anointing, you know, I'm sort of setting myself in this role to, you know, understand what people want and try to give them something like that. And it feels more it feels like more like a verb I could use in a wider range of circumstances with less confusion. But emotionally, it's a continuum of christening between Christing and scapegoating.
Okay.
The other thing you said that was, and I guess personal preference in terms of labels, right? We understand the concept, and we haven't really folded the concept directly into the system, but we're at least getting there, which is good. The other thing you said is you focused on sin as disconnecting, right, to yourself or others or God or whatever, which made me immediately think, well, is it also sin to de-individuate?
Well, that's really fascinating. Sorry, connection in my brain. Because if you think about it in terms of philosophy, in philosophy, it's seen more as taking a subject, so someone who is a full other person with thoughts, feelings, desires, complexities, and everything else, and objectifying them.
Right.
So it's flattening them and, in essence, de-individuating, but it's turning them into an object in your world rather than a subject in their own world. So it's like making them a extra in your movie rather than the lead in their own movie.
Yeah, and so the philosophical language is more binary, subject versus object.
Yeah.
And de-individuating is a bit more of a continuum. It has some dimensionality to it. But certainly there's a very similar sense to that. And so, de-individuating others or objectifying is something that we generally think of as, a negative thing, a thing to be avoided if possible, certainly. This gets, very much the Kant's categorical imperative, right, to treat everyone as an end rather than a means.
Yeah. Yes.
It's in the same.
I'm just trying to work out which categorical imperative.
Yeah. You got a few different levels of them, but
that's fine.
That concise, relatively easy to understand formulation compared to some of the others that you can easily get lost in. But now the interesting question is, if we're following the symmetry, that implies that de-individuating myself is also a sin.
Yes.
And this is where we get the tension, is that, and so the, for me, this, the other thing I liked about the numerical numbers on this thing is you got these, let me pull up the screen here since we all the effort of writing it down. Was you get these skew results where, like, this person, they get some individuation from playing the game, but because they got ignored, they have sort of net negative individuation. Yes. Right. And in a loose system, right, the moment someone feels, so there's the thing about generativity as this tuple, and I'm actually playing with whether I should make it a complex number, if I could get away with it, right? Because then you have a single thing which has, the real component, which is the connection, and the imaginary component, which is the individuation, which sort of maps onto our experience. So there's connection is something that is more visible, you can see it, whereas individuation is more internal. And I have to reverse the order, so it's C plus I. And complex numbers have this weird property, is that unlike real numbers, you can't always compare them. Like, okay, some things dominate the other, like both dimensions are better, but other things are just skew. They're just off to the side and you can't compare them. And there's certain things you can't do with complex numbers that you can do with real numbers. Even though there's a few things you can do with, there's things you can do with complex numbers you can't do with real numbers. And they're both, the same as a two-dimensional plot on an XY axis. But anyway, it's just interesting to think about. Some things are clearly good and clearly, so in this cosmology, if you will. Some things are clearly good, some things
Yeah.
are clearly bad, and many things are skewed.
Yes.
And you can think about, and I think the skewness is interesting because you can think about, well, different individuals have a different weight of how they weigh individuating or connecting, right?
Yeah.
These are the personality types, right? You also can
And you
have,
might, oh, go on. I was going to say you might have one ent that particularly dislikes being in the boss role, and another one that particularly likes being in the boss role.
right,
In which case they're
energy, because they're energy trade.
Yeah.
Right. One is
Absolutely.
willing to expend a lot of energy because they get the energy back.
Yeah.
Right. And vice versa. And then there's the there's also like absolute versus relative. Like I can have like a baseline threshold, but like, you know, if I'm feeling de-individuated, then the idea of having to lose one more individuation point is, if I'm feeling low energy and low individuated, then the cost of paying that energy is really, you know, excruciating, even if the absolute amount hasn't changed, right? So there's a lot of contextuality to this. And so those are the two major variations I can think of. Is, you know, you have sort of a fixed point. So let's call it your joy function, for lack of, I was going to call it joy, but joy is kind of the outcome of, you know, how you evaluate generativity.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that your joy function is based on, you know, so you sort of have a baseline joy function, and then different incidents, and we have joy both based on sort of our cumulative level and also the incidental level, right? So sometimes if I have enough joy, or certain times like a shock to the system will, like, especially if you're not expecting it, you know, even if it's a small absolute amount and you're overall in a good place, it can really throw you for a loop just because it's a sharp thing. And yeah, so you can imagine the second order effects. So anyway, yeah, so this model basically works in terms of trying to make the point and have the conversation we were hoping to have. Yeah. And the model seems to be generative in that sense. I'm trying to think in terms of, where does the model break down for you? Where, you know, where do you feel like, oh, well, like, I think thinking about the voting machine itself as an entity that's being christened to take on this role makes a fair amount of sense. And, you know, in the system, everything is closed. That's fairly easy to extend. Right now,
I guess
yeah.
What it comes down to is what the boss's role is in this. Because we've agreed on the basic premise and the definitions and the deadlock, and we've looked at alternatives for those on how we could avoid the deadlock happening in the first place and how we could add extra rules in, which, oh yeah, I was going to say, is kind of a bit like a church, where you start a church where you have a group of people meeting and then something happens, and so you add a rule in that says, oh no, you mustn't do that. And then you happily go along, and then something else happens and you add a rule in that says, no, you can't do that. And then before you know it, you've got so many rules that nobody feels they can do anything.
Right. That's usually called bureaucracy.
Yeah, usually. But I've seen it so many times in churches, it's unbelievable. And you get just this list of community guidelines or rules, or oh, what's the other thing that they call it? Mission statements.
Well, mission statements, yeah.
No. I mean, church
it's impressive if you have a
statements.
mission statement that is precise and actionable enough that it can function in this role. But as an artifact that is christened to be the receptacle of aggression, like, that is a sign of an effective mission statement, which is relatively rare in my experience. But it's like, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that because it's just out of our focus. We're doing this other thing instead. And actually, if it's, I can see it, I can imagine it is more common for it to be used in the negative, as like, we don't want to deal with that, as opposed to a positive, you know, I'd love to do that, but we have to prioritize this other really constructive thing we're doing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do it all the time. When I have patients come in to see me and they want something that I don't want to give them, so they want a scan, or they want a referral, or they want something, then I will very frequently say to them, oh, I can see why you want that. I completely understand where you're coming from. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to do that referral because of these reasons, or I'm not allowed to order that scan, that has to go through the specialist, and you don't meet the criteria for the specialist referral or something. You know, it's something external to me. It's not me refusing them what they want. It's absolutely just the system.
Scapegoating. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is that many people complain about the bureaucratic system that's so rigid, you can't do this. But the thing is that it serves a really useful purpose. In that being able to, and what's interesting is this, to me, explains why moderns tend to have much more anxiety and high blood pressure and things like this. This is the price of civilization and freedom, which is why our ancestors, who may have lived in much worse circumstances, were probably happier. Because, and I think there's an interesting trade-off here, and that's maybe a good point to think about what goes next for the model, is that the more agency you have, the more you can anticipate. And like one of the things about the way I think about the trade-off of civilization is that I trade anxiety for fear of the unknown. Like if you live in a primitive society, you can't predict the weather, you can't predict when you're going to be attacked.
Yeah.
You know, there's lots of things that can hurt you, but you have no way of predicting them. And so the culture is to just like not think about them. But once you get civilized, it's like, well, you know, we could build a wall.
Yeah.
It wasn't metaphor I was
We're going to put an algorithm in place,
right? We can
protect against everything, and
right, yeah, we can like plan for the future. We can build a grain silo and hoard grain. We can conquer this piece of land and defend it so that we can, you know, raise crops, right? Like there's all these things you can start doing. And once you start getting into that mindset, then like, and this explains to me a lot why, this is why people hate change and progress, is because you are asking them to trade their level of comfort for a more adaptive, but less energetically stable situation.
Yeah. And now you're coming really close to Kierkegaard, who talks about the dizziness of freedom and how for him, sin is this feeling like you have to act and you have to do something, but you don't know what you are meant to be doing. And so he calls grace that moment where you find out that it's okay to not know what to do. And it's okay because there isn't a right answer. It's just whatever your next step is.
Right. And I think in reaction to sort of Kant, wow, we're covering both Kierkegaard and Kant in one setting, is that like Kant is like, well, the truth is the subjective thing.
Yeah.
And Kierkegaard is like, no, it's not. It's like, you just got to do the best you can. But like, last I checked, the existentialist community that draws their inspiration from Kierkegaard hasn't gotten much further than that. Like, you got to be authentic. And that's about it.
Well, if you look, for example, at Paul Tillich, who is, German existentialist-ish, then he was more along the lines of just this idea that because of grace and because of the grace that you have, you're fine. You don't have to move. You don't have to change. You are accepted as you are, but it may be that you change. It may be that, you know, in the future that happens. And so it's that kind of...
But yeah, I mean, that feels to me like prioritizing individuation over connection.
But the way that he does it then is he says that everybody has an ultimate concern. So an ultimate concern is something infinite that cannot be grasped within your lifetime and cannot be achieved and finalized within your lifetime. It is something you will never achieve, but it is something that calls you and draws you forward and that you give your life to. And for some people, it's the pursuit of beauty through art. And they never capture beauty. They never find that perfect image that they do it and they go, yep, that's it. We don't need to do another picture ever again in
Right.
in
A friend of mine
life.
liked to say,
Nobody.
he had this wonderful line, art is failing like,
Yeah.
is failing like no one has ever failed before.
Exactly. But then for others, it's justice. For others, it's transcendence. And the idea is that you have these concrete, finite forms that you express your infinite, ultimate concern through. And that is how we find connection, because everybody has these connections, and that he sees it as there being an unconditional that underpins everything and underpins everyone, and we connect into, and thus, despite our individual finite forms that we connect through, we all have that connection to an infinite, and
Right,
that
so
connects us all together.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure out how this cashes out, to use the philosophical jargon. So the way you described it, the way I interpreted that as, well, I have this connection to this quest, if I can use that term, this impossible thing that I'm doing. And other people have their impossible quests that are the things that make them fully human, fully authentic. And we can connect around those. Like you and I are connecting now. These are both, this is an activity aligned to our deep internal quests, right? Okay, Tasia has a deadline with a bunch of data points that is not part of her ultimate quest. But she needs that of me, and I need to stop this now to go help her deal with her mundane quest. How does existential philosophy help me think about and understand these mundane obligations we have to our fellow human being?
So that's when you start getting into, sorry, I can't help it, like more of a Todd McGowan capitalism model, and the idea that because of capitalism, and it is a little bit Marxist, you end up disconnected from the product of your own labor, and so you don't actually invest in it in terms of emotional and ultimate concern investedness. So you're not doing this,
like, as opposed to what, right? Because
as opposed to a society that is not run by capitalism, where we're all free to pursue our individual ultimate concerns.
Okay. Have you ever been in a group where nobody wanted to clean the bathroom?
No, because I've always been in a group where for one person, that was the most important thing to them.
Okay, and it wasn't you.
It usually was me.
And was that helping you move towards your ultimate purpose?
Yes.
Okay. So I think this is the problem with any society, though, is that, I mean, you know, any community, is that there is no guarantee that, I mean, certainly the idea of a flourishing or an adaptive or a generative society is one where everyone is able to, you know, and like this project for Tasia, which I was kind of grumbling about, is actually helping me build out some of the data infrastructure and concepts that are important to me. So it's like, yeah, I can find that in there. This is the counterpoint I should mention. When I was talking on Wisdom yesterday, the day before with one of my friends, she said, I hope that you are doing what you love today. I said, well, actually, I think I've got to a place where I have a healthy balance of being able to do what I love and being able to love what I do. And for me, it's precisely about, I do have this transcendent quest that I am on. But an intrinsic part of my transcendent quest is learning how to incarnate into the mundane.
Yes.
And that mundane is primarily defined by the things I don't want to do.
Yeah.
That are necessary in order to exist in this space and to coexist in relationship with others.
Well, that's incarnation.
What?
That is the incarnation.
Right. And the point is that, and that's the thing, that's why I say, like, to blame this on capitalism or, you know, your parents or society feels like a cop-out. It's like, no, these two are in tension. And in a healthy tension, they feed each other. In an unhealthy tension, they fragment and splinter. And so I think that's the thing, is that, like, if you start from this perspective that individuation is everything, then you will resent the systems. And but it's to say that, well, generativity is the goal. Individuation is important. Connection is important. Learning how to christen resolutions that move them both forward is the quest.
And is it also about, we are really good in Western society at partitioning things and compartmentalizing. So this is my free time, this is my work, this is my family, this is, you know, everything else. And so even the way that you phrased the question was, what happens when I have to stop doing what I love to do work?
Well, that's not how I phrased it. That's how you interpreted it.
Okay.
That's doing something that is aligned with my ultimate quest to deal with something that's aligned with my mundane survival.
Yeah, but why does the thing that has to do with your mundane survival not have something equally as important to do with your ultimate quest? Because it's all part of the whole.
But that's it. That is my complaint about the existentialist point, where it says what's really truly you is this infinite quest, and that's the level at which we connect. I mean, that's what I thought you said.
Oh, but that's where Tillich says that it's not about living in that transcendent ultimate concern space, because you have to have a finite container. You have an existence. You are alive on this planet in a body. So you have to embody it in everything that you do. You have to take it into the whole of your existence and let it suffuse through.
So I take one to the whole of our existence.
So the thing that drives you. So that means that the thing that
was the question. Is the so I think here's where it gets interesting then, is that is the ultimate quest the thing that individuates us because it's unique to us, or is the thing that connects us because it is the thing that all humanity has in common?
So it connects us because it is infinite. It is bigger than any one person.
Okay, but is there only one infinite, or are there many infinites?
There is one single ground of being, according to Tillich, that is God.
Okay.
That we all connect through.
Okay.
And as part of the ground of being, we experience that as a call to an ultimate concern. So we all
is that a unique call, a personal call, a common call?
Yes, unique, that everybody feels themselves.
Okay.
But it presents itself in a finite expression.
Fragment?
Personal experience. Individuation.
Okay, right. So so what we're hearing is that we all have, right, but is this statement that this is what is the truest thing about us, is this unique call towards the infinite?
It is that we are all connected through that call. So at our core, we are all connected.
Okay, so there's a certain...
It's like in the way that you can plug into a wall socket that is an individual wall socket in your house, but ultimately all of the cables run to a generator.
Right, sure, okay, I get that. But there's the metaphysical connection to the infinite that we all share, right?
Yeah.
But then there's like, when I'm standing in line at Safeway, we share this particular point in time and space because we both, I need milk, he needs beer or whatever. And, if he, takes forever fumbling with his checkbook
Yeah.
or whatever to pay it, like I get very frustrated with this human being. And it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like his screwing with his checkbook is connected to his ultimate purpose, but he's definitely impacting my existence. And
Mhm.
what does Telek say about that kind of connection?
Probably not much about that.
Yeah, so let's just not, we're going to Telek,
So
let's
let me
just,
think.
okay.
Let me think. So if the problem is between how another person's actions, etc., affect you on a moment-to-moment basis,
Mm-hmm.
then you start looking at why you get cross at that. And then it starts becoming more about your, because you're then talking about your individual identity, the mental processes that make up you, being affected by other things in the world. And then you need to start thinking about, well, why do you react to something in one way or another? Because it could be that on another day where you don't have a meeting that you need to get to and you're running late and you've got a list of 15 things to do and your wife shouted at you before you left the house and your kids were annoying and blah, 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 you might find that it doesn't annoy you in the slightest.
Right, yeah. So, but I think the point though is that, I mean, I think you're giving an affirmative answer to the question I asked at the beginning is, have existentialists really gone far beyond the individuating aspect? And I think to me, the answer is that as I'm sure individual existentialists have, but in terms of the common theory of existentialism, it still really seems to prioritize individuating and trying to build connection on top of that.
Okay.
And I think that like the alternative viewpoint, which is that that connecting is itself a first order, if not even prior good to individuating. We individuate against a context of connecting. And there is this, the goal is not to subjugate one to the other. The goal is to try to find the harmonic reconciliation rather than dissociation. Because for me, like the curse of civilization is that in order to survive, we must dissociate. We must, create scapegoats within or outside of ourselves.
Well, and in order to become subjects, we need to dissociate.
Sure. Right.
So like the whole basis is that you start off in an infinite wholeness and completeness. You then are born and you start by having this connection with your mother and you feel like you're all one. And then you go through the weaning process, supposedly. And during that process, you develop your own individual.
Right.
Yeah.
Sense of self and individual. Yeah. But I think the interesting is that that's not really civilization. That's just being human, right? If you're in a primitive society, you have to go through that same process. The difference, I think, is that the roles are simple and fixed, in a primitive society, whereas they are multifaceted and multidimensional and fragmented. And you probably still have dissociation, but it's sort of a shared thing, which is why people are mostly happy most of the time, as opposed to mostly anxious most of the time we are now. And the interesting thing to me is that not trying to get back to the garden, but moving forward to the city of God, is to say, how do we cope with the mundane pressures of life? This is the problem I have with Marxism. It's like they just say, well, capitalism sucks. Like, yeah, civilization sucks. Deal with it, right? And, or better yet, redeem it. And that's the interesting question for me is, that if the purpose of the universe is generativity, we all have that as the shared goal. And when I told my friend when we were talking about this yesterday, it's like, yeah, I'm learning to see the unanticipated. This was I think my claim yesterday maybe, was that wisdom is saying that when the external world doesn't conform to what I wish, trusting that there's an inward spiritual path I can take to restore internal harmony without needing the external world to first change.
Mm-hmm.
And that
that sounds very much like word beginning with S.
Spirituality?
Nope. What's the word?
Sotier, sortition, soma.
It's not a skeptic, it's stoic.
Stoic, right? So the Stoic is different though, in that, like, the Stoic really focuses on the individual. Like, I can only control what's in myself, right?
Yeah.
But this is a more stronger statement, which is to say, you take the idea that we all have this external quest that we are tied to, and so we have that in common with everyone, and that in our strivings to achieve that quest and to cope with all the, not just the obstacles, but the distractions from that quest, is that the process we go through is in fact these mundane entanglements are not distractions. They're distractions from our current perception of our quest. But in fact, they're messages from the universe that our understanding of our quest is flawed. And our understanding of ourself is flawed. And therefore we welcome these things as the signals of how we need to broaden and refine and deepen or even pivot our quest to align with what the universe is telling us.
Okay, so it's not about enriching your inner world and altering your inner world because you have no control over the external world, and therefore the only thing you can control is how you approach things and how you think about things. So you worry about yourself and you ignore everything else.
Yeah.
It's about actively engaging with the outside world with the assumption that if there is a tension, you'll be the one to change, like you primarily as a first reaction, because if there is this tension between what you were expecting and what you're seeing, then if you change your approach to it because the universe is telling you something should be different, then you can resolve the tension and move forward with a different approach.
Right, even if the approach is precisely to, I must hold this tension and wait for something else to change in the environment.
Okay.
Right, prayer is often used in that context.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Anyway, I've got to get back to Teja's data set. This has been delightful, as always. Thank you so much for making the time. I feel like we're making progress. I feel like there is this thing which is communal existentialism that feels underexplored.
Yeah.
Or underarticulated. And if you can think of, and so maybe we can meditate on that and think about if there's a discussion or a model or a christening necessary to flesh that out.
Yeah, I'll have a think.